Let's talk a little bit about Backlash, Wade, because I just got finished watching the event. I just got finished watching Samoa Joe and Roman Reigns in the main event. So you said that you got guys there on site while everything's going on. What's your take on? Well, let's kind of go like loosely match by match over the pay-per-view and what your thoughts or grades or whatever were. But so what was the word on the street just as far as the vibe in the building at this illustrious event?
This was a really puzzling match and a somewhat puzzling event. I think I had high expectations going into it. In my preview podcast that I did, I was like, this looks like a really good show on paper. I don't think it can go wrong. And I thought it went wrong. It wasn't like, I think it was too long. And the opener with Seth and Miz was great. We'll talk about that. And there were some other good moments, but this main event, it started around the time the pay-per-views normally end. They're on the East Coast, in New Jersey, and the match went 18 minutes and it started off red hot, and then it just settled down into something resembling like a mid-90s house show match in the middle of the card in terms of kind of the pace. And the fans, and there's little video clips online of this, fans were getting up and walking out. There was a chant of "Beat the Traffic" going on in your main event with Samoa freaking Joe against Reigns, who could tear down the house. And fans were, there's video that people panned the whole lower bowl, and there was a steady stream of people leaving during the match. People were mad. They were mad about the AJ Nakamura finish. They were mad that a non-title Roman Reigns match was headlining, just it's that kind of crowd in that building, especially. It was an ornery crowd, and I'm not quite sure the strategy that was executed in terms of long rest holds in a match that started red hot. I'm curious for your theory and your take on it.
With respect to the main event or the entire card?
Yeah, well, mostly the main event at this point, like Joe and Reigns. They started red hot, and then they really settled into some long chin locks from Joe, and you could tell the crowd was getting restless. And I remember going to a house show back in the late 80s, and Terry Taylor settled into a headlock in like match number 3, and the crowd was taunting him, and he just looked at him and said, "I'm staying in this headlock till you guys shut up." I wasn't sure what was going on in that match, but it sort of felt like that moment at times.
Well, again, and that's straight up Terry Taylor, old school. He's going to grab hold until you get involved in some way, whether it's heading for the door or start getting involved in a match. And that's just old school psychology. Here, Joe is, everybody knows, one of my favorite workers. Roman Reigns is a fine worker. And it just seems like, whether he can connect with the fans or not. And, Joe goes out there. Here comes Roman Reigns. And, I like the aggressive nature of Joe in the beginning, and then, he takes him through a couple of tables and then, throws him inside the ring. There's a sense of urgency there as he goes for the cover, which sometimes Joe doesn't do a lot of times when he's putting in even longer periods of time and longer matches with other federations. And Joe's a masterful worker, but he showed a sense of urgency. And then all of a sudden, before that rear chin lock, and the rear chin lock didn't bother me, but the one hold, it was kind of that gimmick hold where he kind of had him by the top of his head and by his jaw. And that looked not that great, not that punishing. He was kind of narrating about, whatever you feel this or whatever he was talking about. I wasn't a big fan of that hold. And then the rear chin lock. They did a couple of interesting sequences, out of that submission into, Roman coming on top, then Joe getting back on top. And there was some good stuff in that match. I thought the match was better than people thought it was, but just for some reason, like you said, maybe they started late or whatever. Just mechanically, the match was fine. But for some reason, I don't know, the people either weren't really into it or kind of rejected it. I don't know how to explain it. At this point of the game, we'll go ahead, jump in there.
I think that it's both match placement and context. Like, that's a big part of what makes a match work, is where it is on the show and what happened before it and what fans' expectations were. And so you have this movement among I think the people who pay the most money for the WWE product and feel rightfully so entitled to express their opinion about it, who are loudly and vociferously rejecting Roman Reigns in the way that he's cast. I think they would embrace him as a heel. I really do. I'm not of the camp who thinks they're just not going to like him no matter what. But they don't connect with him as a babyface, and they certainly don't buy this storyline that has been on television, which is Roman making the case that management is out to get him. Because the fans in this crowd are savvy enough and watch the product closely enough to know he's getting title shots that, like a title rematch against Brock after losing clean. And Paul Heyman did his best to explain it on Raw, but it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And then this idea that, well, Vince is out to get me and Vince is a Lesnar guy. I just think the storyline isn't doing Roman any favors. And then the placement of this match. And again, I don't know what match goes on last because AJ Nakamura should have, but you can't end a show with that finish. So I think they were in a bit of a dilemma in that sense. But the fans didn't want a non-title match with Roman Reigns headlining starting at 11 p.m. on a long show that's been a letdown since the opener, in the midst of a storyline that says Roman is being sabotaged by Vince and Vince doesn't like him because people know Vince decides what match goes on last. So I think a lot was working against it. And you're right. I think the crowd rejected a match that they other.
Man, I thought, hindsight being 2020 and just watching the match, the way the fans kind of, a little bit of a hot start at the beginning, well, more of Joe on offense, but this was maybe, hey, you jump this thing and it's tit for tat and you rock them with some solid high spots, back and forth and then, a guy, with a slam, move on the elbow, other guy, it's just, you give them 3 to 5 minutes of some, some sizzle, then settle into that grind, then start putting Roman through those tables and just make sure you grab them in the beginning. But, obviously, when you're talking about this match, early on in the day and you're setting it up, you figure, okay, this is a good plan. We'll stick to it. And then all of a sudden, the people are just not quite as involved or as engaged as you would want them to be. And, when you've got a guy in Roman's position who's on top, and, people are making a case, or from what I've read, from what I follow, and you can speak more to this than I can, and people say you've got to turn Roman heel. Other people say, well, he's already a heel, and that's not necessary. But when you've got a guy, like Joe, very aggressive, and, he's a heel, but he's got Roman in these holds, and Roman has really not endeared himself to, or the people are not that enamored with Roman, to get behind him while he's in those holds, to come behind him and get with the match and start cheering him out of it and being engaged in that match. So I think it was almost, Roman can work his ass off. Roman's a good worker. Joe's a better worker, but Roman can damn sure work. I think it almost reminded me in a sense, not from a physicality standpoint, but many times when I worked with The Undertaker, because you had these two badasses in the ring, and I was the babyface 9 out of 10 times, the crowd could tend to be a little hard just because I wasn't a sympathy babyface, and Undertaker was such a revered figure. I mean, just the way we tied up, as much as I like Undertaker on a personal level, sometimes, in the ring, our chemistry didn't click enough to just get everybody in that arena engaged. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, how much do you, as a wrestler, take into consideration or even augment or adjust what you plan based on where you are on the card? And do you pay attention either to what's scheduled before you or right after you, which didn't happen to you later in your career too often, but what happens before you? And then do you adjust even during the show to how the crowd is responding? Because to me, like Joe Reigns, maybe you can justify it until you get a sense of the crowd in the hour leading up to the match. And at that point, I think we're at 11 o'clock. I think we cut this 18 minutes, down to, and they had the brawl before the bell, but bell to bell, they did about 18 minutes. Maybe cut that down to 11 and just give us the best of and get in and out because it's going to be trouble. Like, do you ever make a match longer or shorter, or adjust the pace of it based on the crowd that night?
No, normally on a pay-per-view, because that's such a big event, you really don't have time for that, and you figure what you got's going to work. So I'm just saying, hey man, I would have think it was going to be a long night. I'm going to jump this thing from the get-go anyway, just based on what I'm bringing to the table, what you're bringing to the table with respect to Joe and Roman. But no, that's very rare that you would change that. And if anything, when you got them when they never really had them, and it's time to go home, there's always a case to be made for going short. But if you go too long, and I don't know, this match just didn't pan out. But I'm glad you brought up the point that you did when Joe jumped on Roman, and then they've got that rule. Back in the day, if there was a guy that attacked the other guy, they'd go ahead and ring the bell and the match would start. Do you remember that?
Oh, totally, yeah.
Okay, well, I think, this has been going on, the way they run the show now, both guys got to be in the corner, and, Joe beat the hell out of Roman, and then, referee's asking him, okay, after the melee has settled enough, and Joe's in cell mode. So, they officially start the match. And of course, Roman is on the receiving end, and it's a beatdown, and then Joe's on top, and it's just like, man, you start off with a vicious beatdown, but then you got to wait for the referee to start the match, and then Roman's already selling, and it's just like, man, you could have had him, but with the referee having to really officially start the match, it's almost a comma or too many periods there where it's like, dude, you could have had us, but with that delay and that official start, not so much. You see?
I do, and I'm a stickler by default for logic in the idea that if a heel attacks a babyface when their back is turned before ring introductions, that they get to have that advantage. And the ref just says ring the bell. That did drive me nuts. But so I like conceptually, academically, the idea that you don't reward a heel for attacking a babyface before the bell, because that just seems ludicrous. That said, you've got to make sure that if you have that pause where are you okay? Are you okay? That you take into account, and this is a lesson that can be learned in terms of, okay, we've got this policy, it's a sound policy, but it backfired on us a little bit here. When the bell rings, then we need Joe to just go and continue, get the crowd hot again before we settle in. Because, this was a match that had some good spots in it. Joe and Reigns giving us a sample, like the drive-by spot where Joe grabbed him out of midair and just dragged him into the ring after catching him in midair. That's a cool spot, but they lost the crowd by then. The crowd had already been chanting, "This is boring" by that point. Rusev Day, and then I don't think they had beat the traffic yet. But if you lose, that's the thing. If you lose the crowd, you can do good stuff, but it's late and it's a New York crowd, and you've lost them now, and you can do good stuff and they won't come back. And they could have had the crowd, I think, if this was the middle of the show and they got to it a little quicker after the bell and shortened the match. But yeah, it's one of those things where you got good spots, they look good on paper, and then you put it out there under those circumstances. And I thought it was, I won't call it a disaster of an ending, but I think everybody was leaving their couch or the arena feeling like that wasn't the show they hoped it was.
So, what'd you think about the finish? It seemed like there was a spear earlier in the night. Was that Charlotte on Carmella? But it just seems like there's so many spears going on now. And I know that is, I guess, Roman's finish, along with the Superman punch. I'm not about the Superman punch. Jeez. I wasn't gangbusters about the finish. Spear out of the blue. Joe had kind of been in control. And then this is the one that takes him out after everybody's kind of been pushing the envelope for so long, with the kicking out of everything. And then, spear out of nowhere, and it's over. 1, 2, 3. Did it hurt Joe? No. But was it a